Okay. And our guest today is Patrick Hagan. This is going to be a very interesting topic. Patrick Hagan, I'd like to introduce to you now as Freedom Friday begins. Hello, Patrick.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, sure thing. It's a little early where you are, isn't it?
It is.
I am so sorry. I hope you like strong coffee or whatever it is that wakes you up in the morning.
Yep.
Yeah. So, Patrick, today's topic is geoengineering. And if you don't mind, I'd like you, because this is your time, I'd like you to tell us about yourself, how you got interested, exactly what it is, a little bit of the history, and the floor is yours.
Sounds good. Well, first off, thanks for having me. I got involved in this about a couple years ago as I was dealing with a number of health issues, and I had came across the work of a medical doctor and also researcher. His name is Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt. He's a PhD and an MD, and he specializes in a lot of the modern day toxins that we are dealing with. And one of the primary toxins that he lists, there's 4 of them that he would list, and one of them is aluminum. And he always stated quite clearly that aluminum was spread throughout the world now and is ubiquitously contaminating everyone in all of our ecosystems from geoengineering or climate engineering programs. Climate engineering, just to kind of define that for people who don't know, or geoengineering, they're sort of used interchangeably. It's basically used as a term for the modification of the atmosphere, the ocean, and the soils for the purposes of controlling the climate on a large scale. Geoengineering, you'll often hear listed as a proposal. It's not a proposal. It was implemented probably about 75 years ago after World War II. And we know climate engineering is occurring because of the lab tests that geoengineeringwatch.org has had. I definitely encourage all listeners to go to geoengineeringwatch.org and look at the lab test section at the top of the page. There's a drop down up there, and lab test after lab test will show very high levels of aluminum, barium, strontium, manganese. A lot of these nanoparticle metal elements that are listed in geoengineering or climate engineering patents for the purposes of large-scale weather modification. And so, when we look at these patents and we look at the proposals of what, some scientists at, like Harvard, like Dr. David Keith will tell you is a proposal of spraying, tens of millions of tons of aluminum nanoparticles into the atmosphere, the upper troposphere and the lower stratosphere to block the sun. They say it's a proposal, and yet we see these elements everywhere in lab tests. Over and over, we see those lab tests coming back at extremely high levels, and most often at increasing levels over time as well.
There's so much, to some people this is going to sound like the Space Odyssey or Lost in Space, because it is so unbelievable. And like you mentioned, this goes back a long way. But
it does.
Yeah.
Yep. And so just to add some credence to that, I think a good amount of people have heard that weather warfare was used in Vietnam. There was a project called Operation Popeye, and it went on for 7 years, and it was, greenlit under Lyndon Johnson, and it was used to basically cloud seed in Vietnam outside of the monsoon season to extend that monsoon season. And what it did is it turned the Ho Chi Minh Trail to mud, and it allowed, U.S. troops to advance and do what they needed to do without the Viet Cong being able to travel on, what were dirt trails that had turned to mud. And so, there's absolutely precedent of weather warfare being used. I'd like to give a couple quotes here. So President Lyndon Johnson, a lot of this expanded under him. And I'll read a couple quotes here from him. So at the time in 1962, when he said this quote, he was vice president, and he was giving a speech to his alma mater in Texas. And he said, It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world. And then in 1958, when he was a senator, he said this: from space, the masters of infinity would have the power to control the Earth's weather, to control drought and flood, to cause or to change the tides and raise the levels of the sea, to divert the Gulf Stream and change temperate climates to frigid. And one more quote for the listeners who want to look all this up, and this is all publicly available. John F. Kennedy also gave an address to the United Nations in 1961, and he said, "We shall propose further cooperative efforts between all nations in weather prediction and eventually in weather control." There are U.S. Senate documents on geoengineeringwatch.org outlining the need for international cooperation among nations in these climate engineering efforts. There's a lot of historical data behind this, but just to give the listeners a few ideas, I mean, I think those quotes are quite telling. And I think the one from Lyndon Johnson in particular shows the level of hubris that some of these people had of referring to themselves as the masters of infinity. I mean, I think most people can look at this and see that when we are interfering with Earth's natural systems to this large of a degree, this is not going to end well for us.
Patrick, I'd like to interject. Now, Patrick and I he's very busy, I'm very busy, we haven't had a chance to speak. But I was so happy you mentioned Lyndon Johnson, because I happened to have that ready to go. I had pulled that up before you even called. I'm like, okay, this will be a good one. So if you don't, I'll play just a little bit of that quote. This is from Global Alert News. It is Lyndon Johnson stating the exact quote that you mentioned.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Isn't that something? There it was. Right, and that again was from the Geoengineering Watch Global Alert News, and that was just put out March 4th, just a few days ago, last Saturday. Right.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's certainly a long precedent in history of these programs being deployed, researched, used for warfare purposes. And this was, this used to be publicly discussed quite a bit more. There was, a lot more, news articles back in like the 60s and 70s on, some of this technology and the capabilities, and sort of pitching it as, some bright future ahead of us of being able to control the weather. And over time, the U.S. did admit to, steering hurricanes. I mean, Project Cirrus was one of these, Project Storm Fury, where these two projects were carried out by the U.S. government in the attempt to change the trajectory and augment hurricanes. And with one of those, they ended up having a hurricane that took a sharp turn and made landfall in Georgia and caused a lot of damage there. And the people were very upset. And so, when you take that into consideration, well, clearly, if they are publicly disclosing that these efforts are going on, the public would hold them accountable. And they did in Georgia. There was a lot of public outrage about that. And, in that same line, we've got, a popular science article from a few years back in China, where scientists had augmented, winter weather and created this winter storm that shut down Beijing for, quite a while. They had streets blocked, traffic couldn't get in and out. And it was pretty well publicized that China was augmenting their weather for the Olympics. And so I think people need to ask themselves, if China is doing this, what is the United States doing when we have a military that is 10 times larger than the next militaries combined. I mean, we are astronomically bigger, and we occupy 80 countries around the world. We have military bases in 80 countries or more. And so, I I think it's quite appropriate to call this, this sort of military industrial juggernaut. I mean, it is an empire and it spans the globe. And so we have extremely large global influence and military presence. And that's important when we consider that there are elements within the United States Air Force that are absolutely involved in this. So, most people in the military probably have no idea this is going on. It's not as if, the whole government is aware of these programs or participate in any way, but there are elements within it that certainly do. And one former Air Force personnel, her name is Kristen Megan, and she has videos online. She provides her testimony of working in sort of the equivalent of the Air Force's EPA. She worked in sort of their environmental quality and sort of safety and health standards. And, I think it's important that people listen to what she has to say. And she talks about this in the Dimming documentary. That's The Dimming from geoengineeringwatch.org. It's also on YouTube. And you can hear her talk about, what she was finding. And just to give a brief summary of that, when she was working in this position, she was seeing, shipment after shipment of, tons and tons of these aluminum nanoparticles coming in. And none of the paperwork was done for them. It was sort of a black box of what this stuff was. And when she took it to her commanders, the first time she got moved to a different Air Force base, and the second time she was threatened. And when she started doing testing for herself, she'd found out about these climate engineering programs, and sure enough, she's finding these exact elements showing up in very large quantities in precipitation and soil samples.
It's eye-opening. And you yourself have done some experiments. Do you want to tell me a little bit about what you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was sort of a spur of the moment thing, and so it's not as if I had any particularly high-tech equipment for this, but one of the important factors in these climate engineering programs is something called chemical ice nucleation. And for anybody who has seen, those they're ice packs that can be stored at like room temperature, and they're warm, and then when you break them, there is a chemical mixture that mixes with the water and creates an endothermic reaction. It makes it very cold. Those are typically ammonia-based chemicals, and there are patents calling for those same chemicals to be used for the creation of winter weather. And so what this allows for is, if this were to be sprayed, for example, over an area that would normally be getting rain, that will turn that rain to snow. And that can happen, at 40 degrees, 45 degrees. It can happen way above normal with the addition of these chemicals. So I'm located near Butte, Montana, and last year, back in May, I believe it was May 11th, and I went outside, and someone in my family had been watering the lawn, and it was a nice day that day. Everybody was outside, and my aunt comes and tells me that where she was watering the lawn out there had frozen. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, it was a nice day. It was May. The ground had completely thawed. Winter was long gone by then, and it was 40 degrees outside. So I went outside and I checked it out, and sure enough, the ground was completely frozen where she had watered. Nowhere else was frozen. And what I did, if people want to see this for themselves too, I took a video of it. The name of the video, if you search for it on YouTube, is called Weather Modification Caught on Camera, Chemical Ice Nucleation. And what I did in that video was I took 3 thermometers and I show the temperature of the air. 2 of them were meat thermometers, so I stick them in the ground just to prove that, the ground had thawed by then. It wasn't as if somehow this water was sprayed on a very cold ground and then it froze. That's certainly not the case. And so I checked with 3 thermometers. I still have a screenshot on my phone as well of my weather app that said it was 40 degrees. And so essentially we had, 38 to 40 degree weather out there where water was freezing. And as everybody knows, water freezes at 32 degrees. What happened out there should not be possible. And the only way it is possible is with an endothermic reacting chemical. At the end of that video, I do something called the flashlight test, and I definitely encourage listeners to do this. What you do is go out on a dark night, ideally away from light pollution, and when there's very little moonlight, that sort of thing, and get the brightest flashlight you can and shine it straight up, and just take a look at what is coming down. And I show that at the end of the video, and you will not like what you see. I mean, there is a staggering amount of this geoengineering fallout that is coming down. And of course, we are breathing this in all the time. It is affecting soil microbes and just the health of our soils. It's killing insects. From phys.org, phys.org. I definitely encourage listeners to look this up. The headline of this, or the article title, is "World Seeing Catastrophic Collapse of Insects," and then an excerpt from that article states, experts estimate that flying insects across Europe have declined 80%, causing bird populations to drop more than 400 million in 3 decades. That was from 2019, and we know that these programs have been ramping up substantially in recent years. So that number is likely far worse now today. And even just an 80% drop in flying insects, I mean, that is catastrophic. And anybody who has spent any amount of time understanding how our ecosystems work knows that those insects are foundational. People may remember like a food web or, that sort of thing. And just seeing, how all these different species are interdependent on each other. If you take out something foundational like insects and drop them 80, 90%, probably is more like what we're at today. When the insects are gone, we're done. And so I would encourage people to start paying attention to this. How often do you really see insects anymore? I know it's winter, but this summer, pay attention. And I can tell you there's very few anymore.
And I've noticed that too. And even not so many years ago, I remember asking with friends, where are the bees? Marianne, do you remember that? Mm-hmm. Where are the bees? So
yeah.
Patrick, you are doing a great job. I'm going to give you a moment. We give you all the time to talk, and I think, well, maybe somebody might like a sip of coffee or something. And I am going to play a little clip, and there's so much information, and I'm glad that you brought up Operation Popeye, that is, and the comments made by Lyndon B. Johnson. If a person looks online, they can find so much information. And the YouTube that I watched that you sent me, Patrick, you did your own experiment. You're studying this, and it's affecting everybody. Our guest today is Patrick Hagan. We are going to take a short break, and when we return, we will speak with Patrick Hagan. If you have any comments or questions or statements, or maybe you've noticed things too, feel free to give us a call at 482-1330, 482-1331.
You discovered a way to cool down the planet. Extreme weather events are becoming more common and more ferocious. As the surface temperature of the Earth continues to rise, so too will the ferocity of natural disasters. In 2018, scientists will take bold steps to explore a technology that could reverse the effects of climate change.
Our guest today is Patrick Hagan, and our topic today is geoengineering. What's happening all the way decades ago, this first came into play. And Patrick, you've been doing a wonderful job explaining, for those just joining us right now, Patrick Hagan, just a real short, nothing like putting you on the spot, right, Patrick? A real short clip. note the definition of geoengineering, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So for anybody just joining, we're talking about geoengineering, and geoengineering is essentially the intentional augmentation of Earth's climate systems, essentially, and augmenting the climate systems for the purposes of overall control of the weather and the climate, as well as the use of weather warfare.
Now, you had mentioned, as one example, Operation Popeye. And my first thought with anything, with all these topics in the world, my first thought is always follow the money. Who's making the money? Who's getting paid off? Is there a money trail here that you can tell? I could be wrong. Maybe it's not in every case, but it sure is a form of manipulation to win wars, make things more difficult, possibly control people. Would that be also a reason?
I think it's possible, but I think what we know for sure is what is in these lab tests, and that they match these climate engineering patents. Ultimately, I think a lot of these programs are used for control in one form or another. And he who controls the weather will control the food supply and thus control the world. So, you can bring populations to their knees covertly without even having to fire a single bullet. And I think that's a very powerful weapon. And I think those in power know that. I think, a lot of people are, rightly concerned with Second Amendment, issues these days. But, as all the focus is on that, in terms of warfare and keeping your safety and security, how many people are really aware of weather warfare programs, biological warfare? There are economic warfare. There are plenty of other types of covert warfare that are being used or can be used at any given moment by those in power. And I think while a lot of the focus is on sort of these hot weapons of a hot war, people need to understand that it is much more effective these days to use these covert weapons because most people have no idea it's even happening to them.
We had a caller while we were during the commercial break, and she wanted to talk, if possible, would you be able to talk about fluoride in the water as a byproduct of aluminum? Is that something that you're able to address at the moment?
Yeah, I don't know of the connection between fluoride and aluminum, but I will say that I believe it's the Ohio State University has a very interesting article on their website about the origins of fluoride, and that it's essentially an industrial byproduct that gets untreated and then put into water supplies. Beyond that, I can't really comment on anything beyond that. But
okay.
Yeah, I mean, certainly to me it seems toxic waste in the water is probably a bad idea.
Yeah, I remember when I came back here from the south, I remember it was a winter day. It was February. It was a clear blue sky. And I saw two things. One was a prism, like a little rainbow near the sun. I'm like, what? Never in my life had seen that. And then, a little while later, I saw these white streaks, and they were making like squares in the sky. I was afraid to say anything. I thought, apparently I've lost my mind. I was in the heat too long down south, and now look what I'm saying. And now, all you have to do is just Google that, and you'll see that it's the grids from the chemical trails that are permeating the clouds and the skies.
Exactly. And so I think this is a very important point for people to understand. Most people are familiar with, the term contrails, and, we are told that these, streaks going from horizon to horizon in many cases are condensation from jet aircraft. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Lab test after lab test shows that, this is not condensation. This is full of these aluminum, barium, strontium, manganese nanoparticles, and now graphene is found in most of the precipitation being tested by geoengineeringwatch.org. And to further prove this, in the Dimming documentary done by Geoengineering Watch, they took a NOAA flying lab, which is basically an aircraft used for taking air sampling, for testing. And they went up there with scientists and flew into one of these man-made cloud layers, these induced cloud layers coming from these aircraft. And they took it straight from that cloud layer, took it back and tested it. And sure enough, it's just full of aluminum and these other chemicals and these other metals. So I definitely encourage everybody to go and look at the lab tests at geoengineeringwatch.org for those just joining. And yeah, these are definitely not condensation. There's just it's not possible with what we're seeing in these lab tests. So and I think one thing that certainly adds a lot of credence to this is when you look at the geoengineering proposals, they tell you that they would be able to modify existing aircraft for relatively cheap, and by U.S. military standards, it is very cheap. They would be able to modify these aircraft and spray these particles out, and what they would be doing is coming out of the back end of a jet and spreading into a cloud layer to reflect the sunlight, to do all kinds of things in terms of climate modification. And that's exactly what we see. If you take a look at those trails coming out of those jets, very often they spread into this wide, hazy cloud layer. And I would ask listeners, how often these days do you actually see a truly blue sky anymore? Most often, if there's any amount of blue, at least over here, it is a very hazy, light, kind of sickly blue. Very rarely do we actually see a deep, truly blue sky. And usually by the end of the day, those jets are flying in and spraying all of these particles everywhere. And by the end of the day, we're left with this hazy cloud canopy, very few cumulus clouds anymore. I mean, it's almost all these, thin, kind of canopy cover clouds. It's exactly like you said, Chris. It's, you've got these grid patterns, everywhere. And I would encourage people to look at the satellite imagery captured by Geoengineering Watch. Those images are shocking. You see what are clearly, man-made aerosol dispersions. And again, they're spreading out in the atmosphere, creating this hazy cloud layer. And so often these days, I'll look over towards the mountains here in Montana, and it's just this, whitish, silvery haze between myself and, the mountains. And of course, everybody can see it, but very few really take the time to notice it. That silvery haze, what is sprayed up there always returns to Earth. What goes up must come down. And that's why we see that in that flashlight test. Like I said, if you take the brightest flashlight you can get, shine it up at night, and you'll see this stuff falling out. And of course, we're all breathing it in.
I have seen, I've seen the trails, contrails, contrails, and sometimes you can see them going straight up. And if I pointed out, somebody would, hey, did you see that? Look, that's a plane. I'm like, really? Do you think anybody's going to get on a plane that's going straight up to the sky? I don't think so. Oh, it must be a jet. I said, oh, really? A jet going straight up, because every now and then I'll see them go straight up. But many times, too, in the summer, and up here, we're right on Lake Superior. We're so fortunate to be right there on the lake, and it'll be a nice blue day. And I love the term you used, sickly blue. Some days it's a sickly blue, but I think, there's Lake Superior. How gorgeous. And then I see the trails start. And then it takes a little, not too long, but you can see them widening, and then pretty soon they're gray, and next thing you know, it's a gray day. Perfect summer day turned into a gray day. And I've watched that so often for many years now.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's horrifying.
Yep, and it happens over and over and over. And I think, like I said, a lot of people these days they're distracted by whatever it is in their own lives. People are looking at their phones, they're paying attention to what's in the news, and yet none of this really makes the news. There are a few articles here and there, but it's not pushed on people. It's not propagated. I mean, I think people need to ask themselves, isn't an 80% decline in insects more important than whatever sort of political drama is going on in today's news cycle? I mean, that's the food we eat. And like I said, when those insects are gone, we're done. So I think it's very telling that a lot of this stuff isn't covered. I mean, I would ask people, how many know that a year ago, Antarctica was 70 degrees above normal at the same time that the Arctic was 50 degrees above normal? I mean, those are staggering increases in temperature there. And to have that happening at the same time is, I mean, it's mind blowing. And when those poles melt down, and they are absolutely in meltdown. I know some people, question that. There is no question that, Arctic sea ice volume is decreasing dramatically. And one of the huge problems we have is these feedback loops that are triggered by that. Ice is very reflective. It's white. It reflects a lot of the sun's energy back off the earth. Ocean is much darker. That water is much darker, and it absorbs most of the sun's energy, where the ice reflects it. And so when that ice starts melting, the oceans start absorbing more of this heat, and it causes a feedback loop. More heating causes more melting of the ice, and therefore we retain more of that heat. And there are many feedback loops that are already triggered. We're in a similar situation with methane. I would encourage people to look up the Siberian methane craters, where methane is literally exploding out of the ground and leaving these craters. And methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And same situation with that. When more methane releases, it causes more heating, and that causes more methane to thaw. And so these are these runaway chain reactions, and those are just a couple of them. There are many. So we are certainly not in a good situation, but I definitely think that we have a real opportunity to do something about this. And so I definitely encourage people, go check out the website, check out Dane Wigington on YouTube, look at the Dimming documentary, send that to people that make your voices heard on this. We all have the ability to do a lot more than you might think. And if you look at sort of the power of exponents, if you raise awareness to 2 people on this issue, and they do 2 people each, that quickly can reach 1 million or more people within like 30 days. So it's important that people realize that we're not powerless in this. We absolutely have the ability to do something about this issue.
The effects, I want to go back a little bit to graphene, the effects of graphene on a human body. And so I checked real quick: abnormal activation of immune cells and thrombogenicity, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So it has graphene has this effect on people, and that's being released. And you're right, you mentioned, well, everybody's busy, and that is true. And people are just running around, but they don't often think about the insects, maybe in passing. Hey, have you seen a bee lately? No, not so much, or anything. But this is much bigger than people, I think, even realize. And now, like you said, now's the time to tell somebody about it. And once the word starts to spread, what can people do? Because it's been going on for a long time, all the way back to, what you say, 75 years, and bringing up different programs. What can people do in their own communities? Could you help us out on that?
Yeah, well, I think the first step is definitely get the word out there. If people don't know what the issue is, if they don't know what the enemy is, how can we do anything about it? So that's the first place to start. Beyond that, we'll see. I think that's an important bridge that we need to cross first. But I certainly am a big proponent of growing your own food supply. I think we've gotten so disconnected from nature. I mean, food does not grow on grocery store shelves, right? And so, like I said, if we are having these species and ecosystems collapse, and many are dependent on the other, so you have these cascading collapses, when that goes, I mean, yeah, Costco, those shelves are going to be empty, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I am a big proponent of, regenerative agriculture, regenerative ranching, homesteading, that kind of stuff. Those are some of the only places that I've seen where life is coming back. You see this rejuvenation of insect life and soil microbes, and more than anywhere else, those places have done better over time, not worse. But even those, of course, if the Earth continues superheating, if our ozone layer is, destroyed, and we'll touch on that in a minute, there's nowhere to run from this issue. It has to be confronted. You can't go off to some island. You can't, sit in your remote, cabin. It's not going to happen. We have to do something about this. And on the ozone issue, most people had heard, back in the 80s that there are these ozone holes over the North and South Pole, and it was caused by CFCs, and, we banned those, and, the ozone layer is getting better. No, that is a complete lie. I would encourage everybody to look up this study that came out a few months back. The title of the study is Observation of Large and All-Season Ozone Losses Over the Tropics. What this study found was an ozone hole over the equator that is 7 times larger than the ozone holes over the poles, 7 times larger. And the researcher stated that, that ozone hole has probably been there for 30 or 40 years. Now, how is that possible that the entire scientific community has gone along with this narrative of the ozone layer healing, and it is far worse than it has ever been? And I would encourage people to pay attention to how the sun actually feels on your skin these days. It is extremely intense, and it will vary from day to day. The ozone layer isn't this totally uniform layer, but it is, there are days where it is very noticeable that something is clearly wrong here. And this is something that Geoengineering Watch has been monitoring. They've been working with a former NASA contract engineer, and they have all of their high-tech metering equipment, and they have been tracking how much UV radiation is actually hitting the Earth's surface. And most people know about, UVB radiation. That's what causes you to burn and get a tan and that sort of thing. There's UVA radiation, and then there's UVC. And UVC sterilizes everything. It kills everything. And that is supposed to be stopped by the ozone layer. And Geoengineering Watch has been showing rapidly increasing levels of UVC radiation on the Earth's surface. And that is happening only because the ozone layer is, collapsing, and that is happening because of these geoengineering programs. One of the scientists working on this estimates that there are 40 million tons of these particles being sprayed around the globe every year, possibly more. But 40 million tons is staggering. And these are, metals, these are elements typically in their free form. And that is a huge problem because, aluminum in nature, it's always found bound to something. It's the third most abundant element in the Earth's crust, and it is, bound to like silicates and stuff like that. And so, when you encounter aluminum in nature, it's pretty inert. It's bound up. It's not very active. When you have aluminum in its free form, it is very hungry to bind to something. And aluminum oxidizes like many metals. And when you are spraying millions of tons of this into the atmosphere, that disrupts the creation of ozone. And so that's why we're seeing just massive declines in our ozone layer. And there's a very good video on this on YouTube if anybody wants to see this. It's called Imminent Ozone Layer Collapse on Dane Wigington's YouTube channel. And that's also found on geoengineeringwatch.org if anybody wants to view that.
Marianne, that caller asked a question, and this, I think, is probably really relevant to what we're talking about. What did our caller ask?
She said that she's noticed in the last couple of years that there's less ants obstacles, even when you're walking outside, the anthills, and less ants getting into our homes.
Yeah. Yeah. There's, I would say that's pretty much the case with wildlife across the board. I mean, and it can't be any other way. When you are dumping millions of tons of these toxic elements on, the entire planet, I mean, we are seeing collapses everywhere in natural wildlife populations. And it is becoming harder and harder for that wildlife to survive. One thing that ties into both this and the ozone layer is, I would encourage people to look up whales getting sunburned. I mean, it's documented several times that numerous whales are getting, their skin is blistering from the sun, and these are animals that should be, obviously well adapted for normal conditions. Of course, they would be, but something is clearly changing, and the researchers in those studies, cite it. It's obviously tied to a declining ozone layer. And so again, how is it that nobody hears about this stuff? It's just, it's not widely known at all, and yet it is the most pressing matter of our time. I don't think there's any question about that.
Yeah, because as you mentioned, this affects everything, and yet people know nothing. And we only have 5 minutes. We have 5 minutes left. What's this? Where are the planes launching from? Marianne. Okay, so somebody else just called. Where are the planes launching from with the chemicals?
Right, like where are they flying out of?
Good question.
Yeah, the logistics is something I don't know fully. I will tell you, if you look at the flight tracker radar app, and you see these jets that are spraying these, long trails, it looks to me that many of them are still going to big commercial airports. Now, if those jets actually have people on them, I have no idea. I will tell you that Dane Wigington from Geoengineering Watch has stated that the U.S. Department of Defense has leased, I believe it was 800 commercial aircraft. And so I would ask, why why would they be doing that? I think that there's no question that the U.S. Air Force is involved in this. And so, military bases would clearly be implicated in this. And that's, I think, again, the testimony of Kristen Megan clearly outlines this, and the lab tests that she had been doing, and her experiences in the Air Force, seeing these elements coming into their bases.
Another question that a caller had: when these chemicals are going up, do the people who are, maybe they're sailing at home somewhere, just, like a computer game. I don't know how this operates. But the question was, aren't they worried about the effects on their lives and their loved ones and their families when this is released? Anybody who is working on this is part of the problem.
That's right. Well, that's certainly a good question. And I think a lot of people working on these programs, if you look at the way this is typically, any sort of secretive program is done, there's a lot of compartmentalization. And so you hear this frequently in the military, that it is a need to know basis. If you don't need to know, you are not going to be told. And so I think it is almost certainly the case that many people working on this don't really even know what it is they're doing. And for the people that do, I think there is a clear precedent of just a lack of awareness of consequences for what these people are doing. I don't think most people know that over 2,400 nuclear bombs have been detonated on this planet. Most people know that 2 were used in World War II. No, it's over 2,000. And hundreds of those were in the Earth's ocean, and hundreds were in the Earth's atmosphere. And so, all of us are dealing with that radioactive fallout still today. I mean, it can't be otherwise. It is everywhere. If you look at the chemicals just everywhere from crop production, like glyphosate, I mean, that volatilizes, and it is in, I believe the study I saw showed it was in 80% of rain samples. I mean, it's everywhere. And so, that's toxic. You see it on the news today. If you're exposed to it and you develop, blood cancer, call this number. And so, I mean, there's pollution and toxic waste absolutely everywhere on this planet. And so, yes, these people are doing it to themselves, but I think many people are caught up in, the short term of, they get a nice paycheck, and, some people perhaps are threatened if they try to do something else about these programs. But, how many corporations are just doing the same thing? I mean, they're all, polluting to a massive degree, and there is no thought about the consequences to even their own health or their own family. I don't think they care.
Patrick, we have 1 minute left. Mary Ann, what was the comment from the caller?
Back in the 60s, we had leopard frogs all over the place. Every time you go outside, you'd see the leopard frogs, and now there's hardly any. And he attributes that to the lack of insects, as you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly the case. And, with these issues, there are so many factors at play. I mean, like I said, there's industrial pollution from countless sources. And so, I think it is impossible these days to identify one particular source of these problems, but it can't not be a factor. I mean, it has to be a factor. And so I would just like to leave on this note. So, like I had said, if you look at the dimming documentary on YouTube, go to geoengineeringwatch.org and share that link with everybody that you can. And if you want to donate to help fund research, advertising, flyer distribution, and billboards to help get the word out there, go to geoengineeringwatch.org on the homepage and look for the donation link on the right side of the page. And if you would like to send in photo or video evidence, or if you or someone you know is involved in these programs, or would like to contact me personally, you can email me at stopclimateengineering@proton.me. That's stopclimateengineering@proton.me.
Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a remarkable program, and I do hope that you'll join us again.
Absolutely. I would love to.
We've been speaking with Patrick Hagan. Thank you, sir. And you are listening to Freedom Friday,
where you have the freedom to speak freely.